his or her individual decision making, and I think we can accomplish those things. Last thing I would just say is about Medicare, because by the way, I just heard that there's going to be an ad run against me on cable saying I want to destroy Medicare. This is one of the problems you have when you're going to have to deal with a problem, when you're going to deal with a situation. Senator Lieberman, Democrat from Connecticut, who was the Democratic nominee for Vice President of the United States a couple of terms ago, said recently, we must reform Medicare to save it. We must reform it to save it. Now, what I have said, in terms of my position on Medicare, is I think we ought to grandfather in the grandparents. Meaning that if you're 55 years of age or older, we're not going to change the system, okay? I mean, because people are used to the system the way it is, they're afraid of changes and so forth. But the fact is, the system as it is now cannot be sustainable. So, if you're 54 years or younger, we would try and reform the system so that something will be there for when you do retire. And we think that there are specific reforms that will help bring the overall cost down. Will give more government support to those people who are at the lower income levels, less support for those who are wealthier, and have individual decision making at the base of it. Other people may have other ideas. The fact of the matter is, I'll tell you what's going to destroy Medicare. Doing nothing. Doing nothing. So, well, let's get way in the back. I'll try and go back and forth.
Yes, there's been a lot of flack in the media about involvement of the Tea Party in the debt crisis.
Yeah.
Were we to help or hindrance?
We wouldn't have had the decision that we had ultimately without the influence of the Tea Party, I think. That is, I think the Tea Party and those who may not be affiliated with the Tea Party but think similarly, that we ought to pay attention to how much we're spending, that we ought to come to grips with the debt, that we ought not to be unloading this debt on our children or grandchildren, that we ought to pay attention to the Constitution of the United States, that we ought to actually read it, that we ought to perhaps even refer to the Federalist Papers, which perhaps is the greatest document on political theory ever written. European countries study it, and our kids don't even know about it. All of those things I found were things that people who either claimed they were part of the Tea Party or said they were sympathetic to the Tea Party were talking about. I think that helped. Now, for those who are saying, hey, you didn't do enough and we ought to have the perfect rather than the good, it made it more difficult for us to come to a decision. But overall, I happen to think the Tea Party influence was a positive one. And this description of Tea Party people that I've heard from some people in Washington suggests to me that they've never been to a Tea Party meeting or met with people who represent the Tea Party and find out that actually they're regular folks who just happen to have had enough. Let's get someone over here.
Congressman Lungren.
Yes, sir.
I heard an interesting story about the Bay Bridge about a month ago, and I heard that the top platforms had actually come from China. Okay, I'm real frustrated. I think a lot of the things you mentioned are symptoms. The problem is jobs. If jobs happen, it'll take care of a lot of things with health care and also being able to pay our taxes. I was real disappointed that the top platforms, which were, I guess, not to our standards, came from China. And second, I think, regarding taxes, I mean, even Warren Buffett came out last week and said he should pay more taxes. Okay? GE, 2010, did not pay any taxes. Okay, how is that possible? They made $8 billion. Okay? So those are the questions I have.
Yeah, I haven't examined the GE situation. I do find it somewhat troublesome that when the president could pick anybody in the country to come and advise him on how he create jobs, he asked the CEO of GE to come and talk to him. I thought he should have talked to some small and medium-sized business folks who paid their taxes. I don't know. I do not know how GE came from that. But I support reforming our tax system so that we remove a number of the distortions in the tax system by way of these deductions and by way of these credits and by way of these other kinds of some call loopholes, and lower the overall tax rate, both on individuals and corporations, so that our corporate tax rate is competitive with those in the rest of the world. And one of the ways you do that is to get rid of some of these distortions, and you bring the overall rates down. With respect to the Bay Bridge, I thought you were going to talk about why does it take from 1989 to the present time to build a bridge. Again, I think there's overregulation, makes it more difficult for us to do that. On jobs, if you look at the overall U.S. economy over the last, let's say since the 1970s, a major distinction with Democrat or Republican president, administrations, Congress, and so forth, a major distinction between us and the Europeans has been we've created jobs they haven't done a very good job of. And one of the major differences has been their reliance on more spending by their central government. And ours has been a more agile society, a more creative economy as a result of better tax policy, better regulatory policy, and an idea that there ought to be equality at the starting line rather than the finishing line. We had a major debate on this in the 80s, and it was our system at that time versus the Japanese system. And the Japanese system was based on the fact that government would invest and they would direct capital as opposed to the marketplace doing it, individuals making decisions. And I think that has proven correct. The problem is that we now have a, some people call it a recovery, I don't know if you call it a double-digit dip recession or a continued recession, but whatever you call it, we aren't creating jobs. And we have, I think, with respect, tried it by the way of injecting money into the system by way of government programs, as opposed to looking at the tax and regulatory side. So, you know, people disagree with me, and I understand that. The president disagrees with me. His approach was one. Mine is a different one. I think the way of getting jobs created is in the private sector. How do we make ourselves more competitive with China and some of the others? In part, right now, our corporate tax rate effectively is higher than it is in the rest of the world. That doesn't make sense, number one. Number two, if American companies make profits overseas and bring them here, they're penalized relative to whether or not, relative to if they had kept them overseas. I'd like to see us at least bring the effective rate on those profits down to what it would be if they kept them in a foreign country, so there would not be any incentive to keep them overseas. As a matter of fact, I would even go so far as to say I would give them a tax break relative to what they would pay overseas to encourage them to bring them back here. Make some of your profits over there, then bring them back here where you would invest them for American workers in American plants. And then the last thing I'd say is, I've tried to go to companies in my district to find out how they're able to compete. There's a company down in Rancho Cordova called Tri-Tool. I found out about it because I happened to be sitting next to a guy from Tri-Tool on an airplane. He's an engineer. He was coming back from Holland. They make a piece of equipment nobody else makes in the world. It does precision cutting of huge metal pipe that is used to do offshore drilling and then bring oil onshore. They have 20-foot sections. They have to cut both ends. They then couple them together, and then they weld, and they drop them thousands of feet into the water. You got to make sure that's pretty tight. They produce that right here in Rancho Cordova. They got several hundred employees down there. And he told me, and I said, well, how do you compete? He said, because we do R&D every year, my engineers are well trained, and I invest enough in them so that we can do what people can't do in other countries. So, you know, when I asked him what to do, he says, give us certainty, give us a tax policy that makes us competitive in the rest of the world, and some of this regulation. It was kind of interesting because they used to be located in another place in Rancho Cordova. They luckily found a already existing place. They were thinking about building on their property in Rancho Cordova. They found out because of, and people can argue about whether it was appropriate, but they told me about the additional cost attendant to building there because they would have to pay for mitigation to protect certain species. And it increased their cost, I believe, and you can check with them, I think by $1.6 million. They decided not to build there. Luckily, this other building became available where they didn't have to do that sort of thing. But they were saying that would be a big hit with us, the size of our company. And you know, again, you could argue, well, we think that that hit's worth it because we're protecting the fairy shrimp. I think that's one of the species there. But at least we ought to put those things out on the table and say, we're going to require you to have this additional burden, even though we know it will have a reverse effect or a detrimental effect on your ability to create jobs. Maybe we think that trade-off's worth it. Or maybe we say, for this period of time, when we're down in the economy, we either expedite the environmental review or we find an alternative for that so that they can compete. Yeah.
Not being able to make that top section, okay?
Yes.
Isn't that a security risk too? Because if anything should go wrong with China, and we depend on them to make our bridges, I mean, that's an issue. And the contractor actually stated that he couldn't get that top section here in the U.S.
Oh, I do think those are problems. I mean, I do think we have problems in terms of destroying our manufacturing base. But the question is, how do you maintain it here? And I talk to people who want to manufacture here, and these are the kinds of things they're telling me. We ought to not make it more difficult for them to manufacture here than to manufacture somewhere else. And that takes a sustained awareness of how we impact businesses here, so that it makes it more difficult for them to be able to create those sorts of things. I mean, most of them that I talk to, they would much rather have a product here in the United States. In part because, you know, the supply chain. If they have a problem, they go right to the guy here. Cost of transportation often make it an incentive for them to buy something here. So, you know, I agree. We've got to look at those things that make it more difficult for them. I'd much rather rely on a bridge made here in the United States than one in China. Yes, indeed. In the middle. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I want to tell you what I think.
Here.
It's unacceptable to me. It's not a Republican, it's not a Democrat. I'm on the lower echelons, okay, financially. I'm on Social Security, I have not gotten a raise, and I'm sure many of you haven't either for 2 years. You're asking us to sacrifice. We have sacrificed enough. Our young men and women are over in 3 wars. They're valiant, they're good people, they're probably the cream of our society. They're dying, they're coming back maybe. That's another thing that's unacceptable. Then you talk about changing the taxes. There's been talk about, and I don't mean you personally, talk about the government, about getting rid of the income deduction for your house, okay? Your property taxes, your interest on your mortgage. You can't ask people like us to take it anymore. I'm not talking about bleeding the people you call the job creators. We just want to, I'm speaking for myself. How about a fair deal for us? I'm fed up with it. Thank you.
Well, actually, this is something I've been working on for a long period of time. I think we ought to reduce overall rates, individual, corporate, all the way through. And one of the ways we can do that is by eliminating a number of these deductions and so forth. Now, you say the home deduction. That is a deduction. I believe it may be the largest single deduction in total in the entire scheme of things. I would tell you that is probably the last rather than the first area that we would look at getting rid of. Now, are there some things they might do? Say, well, interest payments on a loan more than $1 million, maybe you don't get credit for. You don't have the tax treatment for. I don't know whether they're going to do some things like that. But in terms of those specific reforms that the Ways and Means Committee and the House of Representatives have looked at and were on the table in terms of discussion of the President, home deduction, home mortgage interest deduction was not among them. So I would just say that. And you reminded me